Welcome to the Power of Design podcast, where we have inspiring conversations that explore the intersection of architecture, construction, and real estate, so we can understand the dynamics and trends that shape an exciting and powerful built environment. This is your host, Jack Osa. In this episode of The Power of Design podcast, I'm having a conversation with Steve Chaparro. Steve is a keynote speaker and culture design strategist. I really enjoyed this episode because of his interesting personal story and focus on design thinking and strategies to help his clients achieve their goals. Steve is a great storyteller and deep thinker who understands the power of design to transform our life and our businesses. This is my conversation with Steve. Steve, welcome to the Power of Design podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Jack. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate the invitation.
Welcome. Steve, you have a unique and interesting background that spans architecture, branding, podcasting, keynote speaker. What do you think is the biggest obstacle that keeps people away from trying different things in order to find out their full potential?
Oh yeah, I'm very familiar with some of these things. I could say that after being in the sort of the world of adult jobs for over 20 years, I would say that I've experienced many of these myself. And I think the ones that come to mind the most are, I think it's just the plain fear. It becomes an obstacle. And I think there's so many different facets to what that fear represents. It's the fear of rejection. It's the fear of failure. I think it's also the fear of their failure or rejection impacting their own identity. And I think too many times people have their sense of identity wrapped in their performance, the success of their performance. And I think if we do well, or if we're able to convince people well, or if we're making progress, we're hitting the numbers, we're hitting all of our metrics, that shows me that I'm a success. Yeah. And if the work of my hands, if you will, whatever that work is, whether it's literally the work of your hands, the work of your mind, whatever you are doing in business, if you are showing progress in the numbers, then that must mean that I'm a good person. And I think that's just a big misconception that we many times have, is that the success that we are to experience in life is based on performance as opposed to who we are as a person. So I think, many different fears come up, as I stated. So I think that would stand in the way the most for me.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I find myself a lot of times, like going back and forth, because sometimes I know what my identity is and I feel very confident, but somehow you get into the day-to-day and you get involved in your routine. And sometimes we forget about that, and we need to be reminded of where that identity comes from and how we can take things too personal. Sometimes it's interesting when people say, for example, and we all do that, when you fail at something, we tend to say, oh, I'm a failure, instead of saying, I failed at something. Once you say, I'm a failure, you're identifying with that. Like, you're not that. That's what just happened. It's like, if you're sick, if you have the flu, you don't say, I am the flu. You say, I have the flu. It's going to go away. Yeah. But, whatever we identify who we are with, that immediately becomes our software to run our life through.
Yeah, and I think that's such a hard lesson to learn. And I think you don't learn it by being an expert in it from the get-go. You learn by having actually made the mistake of misplacing your identity. And I think even the time period that we're in today, where I think many successful people who, again, have been successful in the past are sometimes not experiencing that same success in these last 6 or 7 months, and where they've been very good at making things happen, it's much more difficult to make that happen. And I think there is, in my own conversations with people that I know and people that I've worked with, many times people do struggle with that sense of identity because, this is not a normal time period that we're in.
Yeah.
And I think it's really an important lesson to learn. And I think sometimes you really don't know who you are until everything else has been stripped away.
Yeah.
And that's a hard lesson. It's such a hard lesson.
Yeah. Tell me about you. Where are you from? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I come from a family with a Mexican heritage, but I'm fourth generation here in the United States. And so I was born in the Chicago area and lived in that sort of Chicagoland area for the first 5 years of my life. And then we moved to Michigan, where I spent the next 10 years of my life until I was 15. I mess around with a lot of my friends from Mexico and say that I grew up in Michoacan, but it was actually Michigan.
That's funny,
and
man.
they get them mixed up sometimes.
I get the joke.
But then at the age of 15, we moved to California, which for me at that point was the Mecca, because that's where Disneyland was. That's where Hollywood was. Even though I was a Detroit Piston basketball fan, that's where the Lakers were and all of these different things. So pretty much in my high school years and then on into college until now, I've been here in Southern California.
Cool. And tell me about your professional life. How did you start to get into the professional world and developing your career?
Yeah, I would say it actually started back in my ninth grade. I'll go that far back because it was in my ninth grade year back in Michigan where we had an assignment to just explore a potential career path. And I don't know what it was, but I settled on writing about being an architect. And so at that point, due to my research, I don't know what I knew about myself. There was something there that I probably instinctively knew. But I actually decided then to pursue a career in architecture and went to architecture school here in Southern California at USC. So I finished that program and then actually went into the career of architecture. I found a really awesome opportunity to join a regional firm here in specifically, yes, Southern California, LA area, but in the Inland Empire, which is sort of San Bernardino County, a really great regional firm. And I really cut my teeth there. I spent 5.5 years there, first as a designer, then as a project manager, really getting some project responsibilities that I would not have dreamed that I would get. And, usually you hear, especially when I came out of school in 1997, and it was back when the market was starting to ramp back up, because when I started school in 92, it was a really bad year for our architecture students to get jobs. And by the time we graduated, it was on the upswing again. But a lot of the opportunities back then were to work with firms where you're going to get relegated to do some detail. Mm-hmm. Like if I was going to go work at HOK, which I did get an offer to go work there in Kansas City, it was going to be some small niche function that I was going to have to do. So at this firm, WLC Architects, I actually learned a lot, and I actually was able to manage projects from literally beginning to end. And I remember going to the job site at the age of 25 and performing construction administration and really being respected by the contractor. And that was it was just an amazing thing. But that also brought some hardships in that it was a sink or swim type of culture. And mm-hmm. and after about 5.5 years there, I got a little bit restless. I got restless within the four walls of architecture. And I wanted to, I actually chose not to pursue pure architecture. I decided not to get my license because there's one thing that actually I can trace way back then, and it was the fear of being niched. Yeah. And what I mean by that is, if I got licensed as an architect, that was going to be my career for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And I wasn't sure I was ready to do that, because once you've been in the career for 20 years, it's hard. You've got so much invested in the industry, and it was going to be really hard for me to switch gears. So I decided to switch gears after being in the industry for 6 years, and decided to apply what I learned in design into real estate development, doing master planning. I went to go work for a home builder, which I remember hearing my architecture professors kind of giving me, the no, because you're going to do cookie cutter homes and communities.
Yeah, no, that's a scene in the architectural world.
Yeah, it wasn't well received, but I would say that I learned a lot about community planning, about entitlements, about real estate development in terms of the business side of that. I was there for 8 years, and about 5 years of that was really learning the business side of things and leading teams through these business things. And so, I spent some time there when the market tanked in real estate. I had to reinvent myself again, and it was as a financial advisor, because in 2010 there was no real estate jobs, no architecture jobs.
Yeah.
So I went and became a financial advisor, which I called it financial architecture, because it was financial planning, so strategy, long-term planning. What is your vision? How can we forecast that out and develop a plan to do that? So it was still architecture for me, just in a different arena. I had the opportunity to come back into real estate development, and then last firm that I was at was Visionary Studios, where I was VP of Strategic Design. And that's where I felt that I really started to see like all of my career start to come into one role. And that was strategy, the upfront strategy, developing strategy for clients as well as the firm, being the chief storyteller for the firm, representing the firm kind of as an evangelist, and then being in charge of our business development side of things. And all that, I know it's been long-winded, but all of that has coalesced to now what I do is I founded a culture design studio, and that's really helping creative firms transform their culture using design principles and methodologies through coaching and facilitating. So it's been an interesting ride, and sorry for that long-winded.
No, man, that's amazing, and that's what I was looking for. I think part of what I have been very impressed and attracted to what you do is, I think, that common thread of design throughout your career.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
This podcast is called The Power of Design for a reason. And I always think, I had a similar career where I've been started architecture school, and I've been practicing architecture for 20 years, but I'm trying to kind of shake that off and say, okay, what does this really mean? Because I think in the last 5 years, I've realized that the power of design is really permeates many more things than just aesthetic expression or things that you visually see, but the power of design strategies of, how do you design a contract? How do you design a profitable business?
Yeah.
How do you design your own life? I think all those concepts and ideas, they're applicable to anything. And as an architect, we kind of get trained a little bit of how design works, but we don't get trained on the application and how broad that is.
Yeah.
So to me, that's very exciting.
The power of design is definitely that, and that's great of you that you're able to detect that red thread throughout my entire career, because that has always been a part of it. The reason why I left architecture was not because I didn't like design or architecture. I just wanted to explore the different ways that it could be applied. I mean, I even went back to school and got a master's degree in strategic design and management, because I wanted to understand this mix of business, design, and even what I would call psychology, and that's culture. And so, and that's really, whether you're designing, I mean, you could say that even architecture is probably the largest form of product design.
Right.
You talk about user experience, the person actually navigating and using the building and almost creating the building as a three-dimensional story, a three-dimensional experience. We learned that in architecture. And I think, the rise of design thinking, I think architects have, used design thinking methodologies, for our whole career. I mean, these are not new principles. They're just packaged in a way that is probably more acceptable and palatable to the general audience, where they can understand things. But even things like design thinking could be such a, there's a lot of buzzwords that we, whether you're an architect or whether you're a design thinker, we love this terminology. Yeah. We love these frameworks, and we can talk and nerd out all day long, and people's eyes are glazing over and their eyes are rolling back in their head because we're just using buzzwords. And I think sometimes for people to understand the power of design, they need to hear it in their own language.
Right.
And so that they can understand it in their own way versus, us coming out of architecture school, we've got so many buzzwords that people think we're talking a different language.
Yeah, I think that's a really good segue to branding, because brand strategy, design thinking, I think those are all conversations that go together. And branding is how you manage the perception of a people, businesses, services, and how do you help people understand what you really want to communicate. And sometimes, we get caught up in words or things that we like and enjoy and understand, but we don't realize that nobody else is getting that message. And right. That means, we're not moving ahead with the business, or we're not helping them understand what they really need for what they do. So how would you explain to somebody who has no idea about design, what is design thinking?
Yeah, design thinking, I would say in one sentence, I would say it's just a very systematic way of solving complex problems. It's a framework. It's a framework that is not necessarily linear. Even though you may have 5 or 6 steps in that process, it doesn't mean that when you're at the end of those 5 or 6 steps that you're going to just be done. I think it is a systematic way. It's that you can help, like say someone comes in and helps lead you through this process. What many times people do when they don't employ principles of design or design thinking, they have a problem and they believe that the first thing that they should do is figure out a solution for that problem. And there's so many reasons why that could potentially be the wrong way to employ things. Because the first thing in design thinking, now everybody has their own different way of describing that first stage, but it's basically about trying to understand the problem. And the mistake that too many people make is that they assume that they understand what the problem is.
Yeah.
When we're in design thinking, we talk about 3 different types of problems. There's a simple problem, there's a complex problem, and then there's a wicked problem. A simple problem is you know what the problem is. In fact, you already know what the solution is as well. When you go to a complex problem is you know what the problem is, but you don't know what the solution is. Now, when we talk about wicked problems, there we actually truly do not understand what the real problem is. Therefore, we need to understand the problem, and then we can move on to figure out what the solution is. And I think too many times people come to professional service providers like us and say, I have this problem, design me a solution. And what strategy comes into play is first, let's do a little bit of research. Let's understand who the end user is going to be, whether it's architecture, whether it's a product, whether it's a brand, and really understand who is the audience. It has nothing to do with us as the company, but who is our target audience, and really try to understand what their needs are, what their wants are, how do they think, all these different things. And that's what we call a human-centered approach, where it's really, you start with the user, start to really understand what they want and need, and then help you define what the real problem is, what the real pain point is, all these different things. And once you have that, then you can do some more research and then develop some insights and develop a strategy. And then that'll move on to creating some ideas or some solutions. And then you take those solutions, you prototype them, not fully built out, but you prototype them in a very small way that you can then test. The very last step is to test it. Once you test it, you will know if you're in the right direction. Some people think that with design thinking, if you go through all of those 5 or 6 different steps, that at the end, you're going to have a perfect product. No. At the end, you're going to know if you're headed in the right direction. Yeah. And if so, you begin that process all over again to refine it, to define it, or in some cases, you're going to go in a different direction. And for me, this is what I call a very emergent process as opposed to a directed process. An emergent process is one that says, let's go through the process. As we go through the process, the real answers will emerge from the process. A directed process is, I already know what the problem is. I already know what the end solution is. So I'm just going, so Mr. Consultant, Mr. architect, Mr. Whoever, just design me this solution because I already know where we're going. And too many times, this is something I learned in architecture school. Very simple thing was we started learning architecture by manually drafting, even though computer-aided drafting was around. And I remember the very simple principle that they would say: start with a blank sheet of paper. Do not preconceive what the end design is going to look like. Draw one line on your paper.
Yeah.
And when you draw that one line is going to inspire the next line, which will inspire the next line and then the next line. And the more you allow the process to direct you, the best solution will emerge, as opposed to, oh, I already know what it looks like. Because if you do it that way, where you already know what it looks like, you have actually shortchanged and defrauded yourself of its potential.
Sure. There is nothing worse than answering correctly the wrong question.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
That's very common in architecture. I had many instances when I have clients, they come to me and they say, okay, we have this project, we need to do this. And I'm like, do you really need to do this? Like,
right.
Is this a solution to what problem? And I'm sure that if you start digging into why do they need that, they probably don't need to spend that money. Maybe the solution is in technology. Maybe the solution is in their culture or their operations. But yeah, I think that's like a very common way to, I don't know where that comes from. Maybe it's technology that we all want to know the answer so fast, and we're anxious about creating a solution without even really taking the time to understand what the problem is.
Yeah, and I think that happens in so many different contexts, whether we're talking about a building or we're talking about a website, we're talking about a product. I think answering that question that you stated, like, okay, what is the real intention and objective behind this one thing that we're designing, and let's strip away any sort of preconceived baggage that you may have about what that is accomplishing. Like, let's literally say, what is the purpose of the website even?
Yeah.
Like, we want this, like, we all these bells and whistles. I want this, this page, and I want this page and this page. But are all of those features of that website literally meeting the simple distilled objective of the website? And if it isn't, you don't need it. But because we see other people, other companies with highly complex websites, and they're being successful, it must be because they have all of these different things. And I think even a building, we're talking about right now, we're still in COVID, and people are really reconsidering their offices. And, they have believed that their office is necessary to have this dedicated office or this dedicated desk, and we have all these different reasons why we have an office. I think right now COVID is really helping us to rethink and really redefine what is the value proposition of an office. And let's build for that, as opposed to everything else that we have allowed it to be defined as in the past.
Yeah. Do you think this framework and way of thinking can be even applied to people? Helping a person understand, or have you done it for yourself? Like, what's my purpose in life, and how do I go through all these questions and solve it to create a meaningful life?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm working on a breakout session for a conference right now that is really about that. And it's really for a lot of these creative leaders who are what I would call frustrated visionaries. And these are people who have a vision for the future. At least maybe it's a direction of where to go in the future, maybe not quite clarified as a destination. And they see it so clearly, but they have troubles either, one, communicate it to other people around them, or two, themselves creating a plan to get there. And I think, so I think absolutely, I think this whole thing is so applicable to ourselves. And I'm working on that framework as to what does that look like? What are some exercises that a person can use that basically uses the principles and methodologies and mindsets of design thinking to apply to, in a sense, the design of their life. There's books out there that talk about this, but I think sometimes, even those beginning stages of like, okay, let me reframe who I am. Let me reframe and distill down to the very core of what I'm all about. What are some of my fears? What are things that are holding me back? Where have I misplaced my identity? How have I interpreted my successes? How have I interpreted my maybe even what I would call my failures?
Yeah.
And all of these different things to really kind of get to know ourselves and then apply these things to, like, some strategy, some insights, what might be a prototype for, a business or an idea. Yes, absolutely. This is something that can be used even at the personal level, because when I apply it to culture design, culture really is at so many different scales. There's the widespread societal culture, there's industry culture, there is organizational culture, there's team culture, and then what I call the culture of one, which is within a person.
Yeah.
And so being able to use this as a framework to lead them through a process to really understand things about themselves and create, their future.
Yeah. What type of clients do you work with today? And if you can give me a quick example of what's a typical engagement from start to finish with your clients.
Yeah. So being that I come from the creative world in terms of, architecture and creative agencies, because I've done some work with innovation consultancies as well as some marketing agencies. One of the things I've decided to focus on those types of companies. So creative companies with creative, emerging creative leaders, as well as experienced creative leaders. And it's really about, the core thing is about culture. How do we use design principles to help them transform the culture at all the different scales that I talked about? And I mainly do that through two forms of help. And that is, one is facilitation and two is coaching. Now, as architects, we're subject matter experts, right? We go to a professional program, whether it's a 5-year program or a master's program, and there's significant licensing exams that we have to go through to become that expert. And when you get your stamp, you are a legit licensed subject matter expert in that particular area. Now, I've used that to learn a lot of different things. But in my work, I don't come in as the expert, at least not a subject matter expert. If anything else, I come in as a process expert, meaning I know about this process, this emergent process of design thinking, and try to employ that in my help of facilitating conversations with groups, facilitating workshops, because I truly believe that the answers should not come from me, but should come from the clients themselves. So if I'm talking about culture in particular at a creative company, I believe that the answers already exist there. They just need a framework and a process and maybe even a guide to lead them through this process so that those things will emerge or be extracted from themselves. And so I think coaching is a big part of that. Coaching is not an advisor who tells people what to do or tells an executive what to do, but rather leads them through a process of self-discovery, enlightenment, and coming up with the ideas, and even almost the idea of self-accountability as well. And so that's where a lot of the work comes in.
We'll be right back with more from the Power of Design podcast.
The Power of Design podcast is brought to you by OSA Studio, a multidisciplinary design firm focused on creating impactful experiences through the power of design. We partner with our clients to create buildings, interior spaces, brands, and strategies that help you deliver a successful project. As a minority-owned firm, we are committed to building a diverse platform of curious and driven design professionals so we can together pursue our full potential. For more information, please visit us at www.osastudio.com.
What type of clients do you have? Are they like corporate businesses, people? We know what type of...
It varies. It varies. Sometimes folks will bring me in, like say an owner of an agency will come and have me lead, do a coaching engagement with them.
Okay.
where it's just me, a one-on-one with them, because they might be dealing with issues such as, hey, I founded this company. We've had success for the last 15, 20 years, but now this new generation is coming in. I just don't know how to work with these millennials.
Yeah.
It's forcing me to rethink how I work. It's forcing me to rethink how I communicate. And I'm scared that I'm going to be irrelevant. That if I give up the voice to people, the younger folks, they haven't put in their time yet they want to, have certain degrees of responsibility. And so helping leaders navigate through that, or how do they facilitate communication? How do they co-create culture? So part of that is on a one-on-one executive coaching. The other part is it might be full-on leadership teams of those creative companies. Because a lot of times if they ask me to come in and help them lead them through a culture co-creation process, I first say, well, that's great. I can do that, but I need you folks to be on board first.
Sure.
And so why don't we actually have some of these discussions with you as a leadership team first? Because the last thing I want to do is lead your team through this if you're not on board with this. Because, design thinking and co-creation and human-centered design is very much about letting or trusting the process.
Yep.
And many times these leaders have seen success because they have directed the process as opposed to allowing some of these things to happen. So hosting sometimes maybe a day or two of conversations and retreats with leadership teams so that they can first, and then leading teams through 3, 6, sometimes 12-month engagements of really learning how to transform their culture. I've worked with, there was an Office of Civic Innovation as an example, which is actually a government agency within the city that I live at. They act as the innovation consultancy for the rest of the city.
Yeah.
And so they're learning how to act as a true design organization. How do they make proposals? How do they lead? How do they get the capability? So it's a lot of it's capacity building in terms of learning how to facilitate. Because one of the things that I've seen that has emerged in a big way is that even creative agencies are having to work a little different moving forward. No longer are their clients happy or satisfied with the agencies doing the work for them. They want the agencies to do the work with them.
Yeah.
And that requires a new set of skills that sometimes these creatives don't have. And so it's culture, it's communication, it's capacity building, it's all of that.
Yeah. What do you think it's the biggest challenge your clients are facing today? And let's take COVID for granted, because that's for sure here. But the biggest challenge in going into the future.
Yeah. So I actually did. I sent out a survey to creative leaders, and I got almost about 100 responses. And it was, sort of in the context of COVID. But I also think that it does reveal some things that are outside of COVID. And I think when I asked them, what are the challenges that you are facing as an individual person? And then what are the challenges that you are facing in terms of leading your team? So as an individual, what they're really struggling with is focus, especially during this time, is like, how do I focus in my work? It's so different now working from home. And all these different things. So that was the biggest challenge that they're seeing as an individual. But from a team perspective, and I was kind of thinking that it was going to be culture and things like that, but it's actually more about strategy. It's actually their biggest struggles is like, how am I going to develop a strategy for my business? How are we going to truly understand what the current needs of our clients are, versus assuming that their needs are the same as they were before COVID. But Here's the thing. You and I know this term. It's VUCA, and it's not a Spanish term. It's just an acronym for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
That's right.
So we are entering into this time. We are in this time where it's all four of those things. And the reason why strategic planning was such a powerful thing in the past was because it was the opposite of volatile. It was the opposite of uncertain. opposite of complex and the opposite of ambiguous. There was a lot of knowable things that they could bank on. Therefore, they could almost say, okay, this is what we're going to do in 5 years.
Yeah.
Now let's work backwards to figure out what we need to do to get there. Well, it's changing every single day almost in this current environment.
Yeah.
So the idea of strategic planning, in my opinion, is kind of going out the window versus what I call strategic design. And that is constantly trying to understand what are the hopes, desires, pain points, expectations of your clients, but not only of your clients, but also of your employees, because both expectations are changing very rapidly in these days. And I think to be able to have an understanding of where people are at, like what is that moving target, you need to put on sort of the hat of a designer. And the designer is not just designing solutions, it's the design research of also trying to understand what is the current context of the situation. So business strategy in terms of like, what are our offerings? How are we going to deliver those? What's going to be our value proposition? How do we communicate that? How do we communicate that to our clients as well as our people within our firms? It's such a moving target.
Yeah, no, this is like a full circle story, and it makes a lot of sense because I think you are a product of what you're talking about. For me as a first generation immigrant, I came here when I was 24 years old. And when you're an immigrant, you need to be focused on your goal, right? I have no other goal but like, how do I engage with this community and become part of it and add value? And you need a strategy to make that happen. So you need to be very strategic about your decisions, what you're doing, how, when. And then at some point that environment, that is the VUCA you're talking about, is volatile because you don't know it. Right? There are many rules, many things about the system, about the language that are just unknown. You have the uncertainty because you don't know what's going to happen in the future, and you have that time clock clicking. And it is very complex because it's a whole new system and way of life that you have not been accustomed to. And then it becomes ambiguous because you're trying to assimilate a new culture that is not part of your culture, but you want to be part of that and you want to join it. And it makes a lot of sense that, I'm pretty sure your ancestors will be very proud of you because you're doing what they did 4 generations ago. And for some, and I think that might be part of your brand DNA, that it's in you and it's in your heritage to have that way of thinking and that way of seeing life. Because when you come for the first time as an immigrant, you have to do those things, but unconsciously, you have no idea how they are. Very true. That's the path. That's the way you make it happen. And that formula works to get from one place to the other. And I think works to take your life from one place to the other, or your business, and just having the understanding to articulate that. I think that's one of the things that you're bringing to not only to the marketplace, but to the community and to the people you're involved with.
Right. Yeah. That's very interesting. I remember we were working with when I was at Visionary Studios, we were working with a potential client, and this was in fact, it was a church, and it was a church that was in the part of California, what we would call the Central Valley. And there were a lot of Dutch farmers that were there, and they were looking to possibly redesign their building, and they were very hesitant to be visionary or do some bold moves with some of their projects, because they were worried about sort of dishonoring the heritage of their ancestors, even if it was 3 or 4 generations before them who had actually trekked across the United States and went to the West and set up big ranches in a place that was virtually unknown and start from zero. And they wanted to honor what their ancestors had done. And I remember there was a very poignant conversation that we had. I said, your ancestors' legacy was the fact that they forged into a new land.
Yep.
and they started something from zero, and they were willing to upend their comfortable, place wherever they were at before, and start something, basically be a pioneer where no one would understand what they were doing. No one was willing to follow them, and they were able to start something from nothing.
Yep.
The best way to honor that heritage is to do the same thing yourself.
That's right.
And it was such a poignant moment because like the light clicked on in their head, like, oh, wow, we were trying to preserve and actually by our actions, actually be the exact opposite of who they were.
Yep.
And that was to settle for the safe, not to disrupt, but everything their ancestors did was about disruption. So, like what better way to honor them than to live the same life that they did?
Oh yeah, that's a good story, man. And there are many basic concepts that sometimes we don't really stop and think about them. Like what takes you here is not gonna get you there. So doing things a certain way, it's fine, but there are seasons in life and phases that at some point you need to graduate and you need to go to the next level. And one of the things that I use on my own thinking is to always think about a bigger and better future for myself, for my family, for my business. Like the past is great. You learn your lessons, but the past is gone. It's gone. There's nothing you can do about that. Like complaining or thinking about that is not going to help me. The only thing that is going to pull me faster and closer toward my goals is creating an amazing future, a great vision that is going to pull me towards that.
I will say this though, Jack, I think you and I are very, very much the same in that regard. We're an odd bunch, and, not everybody thinks like us. And I would say not everybody necessarily should, because if everybody made decisions like us, there would probably be a lot of instability in the world. And I think there's probably, I would say when you think of the innovation curve, the folks, the first 3% that are like sort of the pioneers in any given industry, I think that's probably the number of percentage of people that think probably like us.
Yeah.
And so that has been my sort of journey of trying to figure out how then do I communicate these things to 97% of the world, the other 97%. Because I think part of my journey has been, I see this. I think like this. Yeah. I think this is the right way to do things. And actually, I point out problems not because I want people to think that they're at fault. I point out problems because I believe there's a better way.
Sure.
And a lot of times that brings frustration because they don't see it. They don't understand it. 7 years go by and finally the light clicks on and I'm like, well, I told you that 7 years ago. It actually is, it's cold comfort for them to finally understand. And so I think for me, the biggest challenge in life has been not that I think any better. I think very differently than a lot of people. And so my biggest challenge is then how do I communicate? How can I be empathetic to people that don't necessarily think like me? Because I'm a very passionate person and I believe very strongly about what I believe. And when people either one say that I'm wrong or that I'm crazy or that I'm thinking too fast, running too fast or whatever, I can push back. In fact, I've even been accused by people that I love, like my wife, of being a bully because I believe so strongly in these things. Yeah. But one thing I've had to realize is sometimes it's not the right time, because a good idea at the wrong time is a bad idea.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And so a lot of times it takes people time to understand and be prepared for these things. And I think that's probably has been the biggest transformative part of my life, is learning how to navigate that journey of the in-between seasons of life. The season between I have an idea and I communicate it or share it with the world, and the time that it actually is going to come to pass.
Yep.
That whole desert time in between of trying to convince people, or maybe it's they need to experience other things, the pain of and then finally realizing, okay, this is what we need. That has been such a transformative period. In fact, I say that I remember, I'll share this one thing. One of my friends asked me, he said, Steve, what is it that you desire most for others? And he said, I desire that they see transformation in their life. And then he turned to me and said, Steve, have you found that for yourself? And like, it just hit me really like in the soul, that question, because I knew what the answer was. Like, I'm constantly seeking for transformation in my life. And that's what drives me to want to provide that for others, because by helping them, I can only help them if I've seen that transformation in my life. And because I can't preach, if you want to use that word, what I haven't experienced.
Yeah.
And so the hardships in my life, the struggles that I've experienced in my life, the low points, the in-between seasons, I have to see those as not only preparation for my own life, but I see them as preparation to help others who will be, if not are already in those seasons themselves.
Man, that's a lot of information. That it's funny because I think very similar. Like I don't want to be the same person I was a year ago or even a month ago. I always want to be becoming a better person. And I even say that in my business, in my company, if you want to work here, your number one job is to become a better version of yourself. Yeah. And then there are some specific technical and professional tasks that need to happen. But if you're not that type of person, you're not going to be happy here, because the whole purpose of the business is to become an engine for people to improve their lives. And part of that, it's understanding that relationship between your mind and your heart. We're all the time pulled by both, right? Your mind is, figuring things out, it's very clear and about reasoning and steps, but your heart is all about relationships. It's all about connection. It's all about a higher purpose. And sometimes they don't go together. And reconciling those things, to me, is when you get to a point in your life where you can have those two different dimensions and you can put them together, and you do something where those two things together help you go to the next level, and then you exponentially grow that, sharing that with others so they can do it as well.
Yeah, it very much so. And I think when I think of like going to the next level is definitely a big part of my perspective and language as well. But I've also come to understand that sometimes it does happen where we go from one peak to the next peak to the next peak, in terms of like, it's just a chart that keeps stepping up. But it seems like for me, there are many times you might go from sort of level to level, but many times sort of the biggest sort of seasons of transformation in my life have occurred when there's actually been a dip.
Oh yeah.
Or a valley.
Yep.
And I think that valley is just a preparation between two mountain peaks or two levels that we experience in life. And I think almost like the level of desperation and the depth of that dip is sort of an indication of the height of that next peak.
Yep.
And it seems like each peak is always higher than the former peak. Because I'm learning. Now, it's different if I actually start experiencing peaks that get lower and lower. And that means I'm not learning. I'm sort of going backwards. And I'm okay with sort of those in-between seasons if they do lead to a higher peak.
Yep.
And so I've come to realize I'm addicted to peaks. And that causes me problems. It really does. It causes me peaks, because sometimes if I'm addicted to a peak in life or getting to the next level in life, it could very much be like that mountaineer who scales to one, crest of a mountain and doesn't take time to sort of celebrate that he's reached the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
But he enjoy the view and celebrate the success. If we're addicted to peaks, we'll get to that peak and sort of, okay, let's take an Instagram picture and let's go down because I want to find another one to scale.
Right.
And that's an addiction. It's addiction to sort of the performance of life. And sometimes we need to just, like you said, enjoy the view.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's enjoy the trail up. Sometimes it's enjoy the trail down. Like I started running again after 10 years of not running. And I noticed that I was so bent on trying to improve my times on the trail that I didn't enjoy. I live here in California. These trails are literally overlooking the ocean.
Yeah.
And people would die for that.
Yeah.
They would have a picnic there, and I'm over here not enjoying them because I'm like, I need to finish at a good time. And it's just like, but I think that's the challenge for people like founders of companies who are very much about trying to perform, and not enjoying the small successes in life.
Yeah. Man, I feel like we're going to have to do part 2 and 3 of this podcast. So I just want to ask you the last question. And it's, how does the power of design impact who you are and what you do?
Oh, that's a great question. I think at my very core, I would say that I'm a designer in that I'm here to solve problems. I believe that by solving problems, you can make things better. I think design is a way that has to be very intentional. I think people kind of stray away or kind of reject the idea of being a designer because they're not trained in a specific craft of design. But I think design is really just about being intentional. It's about being empathetic. It's about really trying to understand what the problem is and then solving for that particular problem. At its core, simple, in terms of the mindset of a designer, it's very simple. The methodology is a process that we can employ. Now, I'm not going to combat those professional designers and architects and say, oh, everyone can be an architect. Everyone can be a graphic designer. No, I'm not saying that at all. When we talk about being a designer and a design thinker, I think there is this difference between the mindset of a design thinker and the craft of a designer. Like those are two very different things. But I think all of us have the capacity to think like a designer, and that's just to be intentional, to allow the process to unfold things. And it has literally shaped everything that I do. I'm very intentional. Like I love Post-it notes. I love sketchbooks. I love thinking about new things. So I'm always trying to get better. And I think part of that is learning new ways of thinking, new ways of working, and seeing that design is really about kind of developing a toolkit of ways of thinking and doing things, as opposed to saying, I found the silver bullet. Because as soon as we think that we have found a silver bullet to doing any one thing, we have really defrauded ourselves of the potential.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate your time and you sharing your experience and wisdom. I feel like I learned a lot today and very inspired by your story. And I look forward to stay in touch and maybe meet you in person one day.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for the opportunity. This has been, I've been watching your journey as well on LinkedIn. I think we've been connected on LinkedIn for about a year and a half, but it was only recently that we've actually truly connected. So I'm inspired by your story and your work as well. And thank you for this opportunity for tolerating my long-windedness here and there.
No, man, they were perfect. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
All right, man. Thank you for listening to the Power of Design podcast. Remember to rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Find out more about Jack and Osa Studio at osastudio.com and follow us on Instagram at the Power of Design podcast. Thank you.